Pirate King's Gold, by Stephen Lake. The complete story. "The wave treader is closing on us," cried the first mate. Brenton stood on the fantail of his ship, the Art-Ego, and watched as a slick, fast-moving schooner closed rapidly on them from behind. He was amazed at how fast the other ship was. This was only because they were running as absolutely light as possible. To them, the impending bounty of gold they'd soon acquire was worth going hungry or thirsty for a while. Many other ships before them had already done the same as well, with the great number of casks, chests, and other supplies bobbing in the water around them giving witness to this fact. He soon raised his telescope and studied the wave treader closely. Suddenly, two small puffs of smoke billowed from its deck. A moment later a bullet tore into the railing next to him, and another buzzed past his ear. "Snipers!" cried one of the men. "Sharpshooters, to the rear!" "Cannons at the ready!" cried Brenton. The men scrambled frantically across the deck in obedience to their captain's orders amidst the growing violence of the waves. More shots whizzed past him, but again missed their intended target. Brenton's eyes narrowed at this. He knew why the wave treader was shooting at him. All of them were closing in on a place called Point Cape, a very hostile stretch of water that was the dividing point between two great seas, and the rumored hiding place of the Pirate King's vast treasure. The only thing that was required to gain access to that treasure was to survive a trip through the Dragon's Teeth, a stretch of water in the middle of the cape that was easily the most dangerous in the entire world. Many ships had gone in. None had ever come out, save for those of the great Pirate King himself. It was rumored that only he knew the key to the teeth, and how to navigate them safely. It was this very fact that made the teeth the perfect place to hide his treasure, as it provided a natural fortification against plundering that required no defending by man nor beast, as the sea was more than an ample guardian of it. Another bullet whizzed by Brenton's ear. But he ignored it as his sharpshooters skillfully returned fire and picked off the snipers on the opposing ship, as well as several of her deck crew. This caused the others to scramble for cover. "Helm, 20 degrees to port." "Ready on cannons," he cried. "Aye, 20 degrees to port," echoed the helmsman. "Aye, ready on cannons," cried a gunner. The Art-Ego quickly adjusted its course and began to slowly close the distance with the wave treader. As it did, the gun ports of the wave treader belched fire and smoke in their direction like an angry dragon. But, to their dismay, every one of their cannonballs missed its target. This was because, despite the wave treader being faster, the Art-Ego was more stable, meaning that the wave treader would have a far more difficult time hitting its target, of which it was. For this, Brenton was grateful. He would soon use this to his advantage. But first he had to get closer to the wave treader in order to make his plan work. 23 degrees to port," he shouted. "Aye," replied the helmsman. Brenton watched quietly as his ship closed the distance between himself and the wave treader as the other ships struggled to reposition their guns to fire on his ship. But their efforts would ultimately prove to be fruitless. "Snipers! Ready! Aim only for their gunners," he shouted. "Ready," came the reply from his sharpshooters. "Fire at will," shouted Brenton a moment later. Flints sparked, powder flashed and muzzles blazed as shot after shot ripped through the air and expertly struck the crew of the wave treader, killing some on the main deck, and some below, causing others to scatter for cover. This had the much-desired effect of briefly silencing the guns of the wave treader. Her snipers then gathered on the main deck and fired at the Art-Ego, hoping to return blood for blood with their own sharpshooters. A few of their bullets did find their mark, killing a few of Brenton's sharpshooters in the process. But the immediate reply from Brenton's men to this egregious attack on their ship quickly turned that small victory into a hollow one as their own sharpshooters were completely wiped out with brutal efficiency, and in a single volley at that. As a casual observer, it didn't take much for the crew of the wave treader to realize that Brenton's men were better skilled, and better trained than their own. Quickly becoming desperate for a victory of any kind, the wave treader began striking some of her sails in an effort to put herself back into a good firing position. However, Brenton wasn't about to allow this. "Snipers! Clear the rigging," he shouted. once more his muskets roared, causing men to tumble from the rigging of the Wave Treader. Even so, those men that remained, and had not been hit, continued their work to get the sails pulled in and properly adjusted as fast as possible. But Brenton's snipers soon made that effort impossible as a second musket volley easily cleared out those few who still remained in the rigging like dust off a mantle. Despite this, the Wave Treader wasn't done fighting just yet, as she still had a few tricks up her sleeve, and Brenton knew this. Wanting to bleed off some extra speed, and correct their disadvantage, the Wave Treader steered hard to starboard towards the Artigo. But Brenton had anticipated this. 35 degrees to starboard. Cannons at the ready. Aim for their mid-deck, he shouted. The helmsman of the Artigo expertly maneuvered the ship to starboard, and pulled it into perfect firing position as he did. The crew on the Wave Treader looked on at this in both disbelief and dismay, as the Artigo, once again, had them in perfect killing position, and they couldn't do a thing about it. All they could do now was sit helplessly by and wait for the inevitable. Fire, shouted Brenton a moment later. The Artigo belched a wave of fire moments later, sending cannonballs through the air, and into the side of the Wave Treader, ripping it apart like it was made of balsa wood. But, despite having done an incredible amount of damage to the Wave Treader, their opponent was still in fighting shape. Barely, but still more than able to dish out a punishing blow of her own if she wanted. Knowing this, Brenton quickly set about making sure that would not happen. Helm, hard to port. Starboard side gunners, prepare to fire, he shouted. The crew of the Wave Treader watched in dismay as their upcoming window of opportunity vanished before their eyes as the Artigo turned hard to port, her masts tipping heavily to starboard as she dug deep into the turn. Moments later the ship righted itself, and the Artigo's port side guns blazed, ripping a large hole in the fantail of the Wave Treader as they crossed over her stern. Brenton then steered hard to starboard and fired his port side guns into the Wave Treader, further wounding her. Wanting to do everything they could to save themselves, the Wave Treader turned hard to starboard, hoping beyond hope to overtake the Artigo's turn, and deliver a volley of retribution at their skillful and problematic adversary. However, such would not be their luck as the Artigo's skilled gun crews continued to rain mortal fire down on them. Volley after volley was poured into the helpless Wave Treader until she could fight no more. Having won the battle, Brenton stood quietly on the deck of his ship and watched as the other ship began to slowly sink into the sea. Stand down our defenses and resume course towards the Teeth, best possible speed. Aye, sir, replied the first mate. The Artigo soon turned back to starboard and continued on her course towards the Cape. As it did, Brenton looked out across the waters around him, and the multitude of shattered, smoldering corpses of countless other ships that covered them. It didn't take much for him to realize that this adventure, a struggle to capture the Pirate King's treasure, would be a winner-takes-all battle for supremacy. The way the other ships' captains were destroying each other in their struggle to secure this legendary and fabled bounty spoke volumes to this fact. All this death and destruction for a little gold, he muttered to himself. It was true that he and his crew were also here for the treasure. But it was for much different reasons. While the others had come in the name of greed, he and his crew instead wanted the treasure so that they could provide the best possible lives for themselves and their families. Most of those among his crew only planned to take what they required, and the rest they would give away to those who were in need. However, first they had to get to the treasure, and that would be no easy task. Especially given the dangers ahead of them. Suddenly, as he was thinking about what he would do next, the Artigo leapt up, and then crashed down hard as a great wave tossed his ship heavily. It wasn't long before another appeared and again tossed the ship. Moments later a loud creak and a groan echoed from the bowels of the ship. Fearing the worst, he quickly hurried to the bow. He then watched as another tall and powerful wave tossed his ship like a cork in a bathtub. He soon realized that the waves were coming from the Cape itself. If they kept this up, they would break his ship in half. From what he could see, others before him had already suffered the same fate, and so would he if he didn't act quickly. He then raced to the stern of the ship. "Helm, angle us into the waves," he shouted. "But Captain, that's suicide. We need to cut the waves directly," protested the helmsman. "The waves are too powerful. They're stressing the keel. If we don't cross the waves, and spread out the weight, they'll break us in two." The helmsman briefly eyed the first mate, who nodded in agreement with Brenton. He soon turned his attention back to the sea ahead as he firmly gripped the helm. "Aye, Captain," he replied. He then turned the ship so that it crossed the waves at an angle. As he did, another ship took the opportunity to cut off the Artigo. But, as it rushed headlong into the waves, one of them caught it amidships and tossed its bow violently into the air. Brenton watched in sickened disgust as the ship then crashed back into the waters with a gut-wrenching thud before snapping in half and slipping quickly beneath the waves, leaving no trace of its existence behind. The speed at which the ship had gone down made the other captains in the area less eager to overtake the Artigo. Instead they turned and followed Brenton's example, cutting the waves at an angle in order to reduce the stress on their ships. A few others, upon seeing this, gave up the chase entirely and turned away. Brenton was glad that they had, as it had already become far more crowded around him than he preferred. He soon returned to the bow of his ship and watched as a group of 9 other vessels ahead of him began forming a single file line as they prepared to enter the cape through a pair of tall, black obelisks that stood watchful guard over its entrance. One of the ships, seeking to overtake the others, suddenly turned hard to starboard as though searching for a swifter, more favorable wind. However, it wasn't long before that ship came to an abrupt and violent halt as its bow buried itself into a hidden sandbar. The force of the impact viciously shook the ship, and sent one of its masts crashing to the deck. A large wave then came in behind it and lifted its fantail high into the air before smashing it down again upon a hidden row of razor-sharp rocks. The ship then creaked and groaned loudly as it struggled with all its might to remain intact. But the next wave that appeared immediately sealed its doom. Brenton and his crew watched in horror as the fantail of the ship was, once again, lifted into the air, and then cast down so violently against the hidden rocks beneath it that it was shattered to pieces. Shortly after this, Brenton noticed that the razor-sharp, sand-covered rocks that had destroyed the other vessel were scattered everywhere on both sides of the channel. Only the main channel itself was safe. Everything else around them was a death trap. This meant that they would need to keep to their course, or else risk losing the ship. There was also no turning back now. The only way left to them at this point was to go straight forward into the cape and all the horrors that lay within. Brenton made his way to the fantail of the ship, near the helm, and watched as one ship after another passed between the 2 obelisks in front of them that marked the entrance. Not far beyond this the ships came upon a massive rock that divided the channel in 2. Upon reaching this rock, the first 3 ships, one by one, carefully turned to port, and vanished soon after behind high, jagged walls of stone. He then felt his ship lurch forward under him. This drew his curiosity. So he leaned over the side, and noticed that a powerful current was now pushing his ship along. Seeing this, he knew that he would have to be careful. While the current would solve his problem of sailing inside the cape, it also meant that he would have far less control over where his ship went. He looked up again and noticed that only 2 ships now remained that had not yet made their turns. He then carefully studied the lead ship as it first appeared as though it would turn to port, just like the others, but then suddenly changed course to starboard at the last moment. The other ship behind it did the same. Brenton found this intriguing. "Prepare to go starboard," he said. "But Captain, the other ships all went to port, save for those 2, said the helmsman. "And we would have as well, had I not seen the lead ship change their course suddenly." "It's likely that they saw something that the others did not," said Brenton. "Aye, Captain." The Artigo then continued on its previous course for several moments longer before turning starboard in the same way as the previous 2 ships had. Slipping into a cavern, just beyond the turn, Brenton found that its ceiling became far lower than he liked. Thankfully his masts were still short enough to allow them through it with little trouble. They soon emerged into a much wider passageway where they found that the 2 halves of the channel rejoined again into one. But, just as they came to this merging of the waters, they looked back and were horrified to discover that the left side channel had actually been full of razor-sharp stalactites and stalagmites which formed what appeared to be a many-layered set of teeth. These teeth had, in turn, torn to shreds any and every ship that had entered through that way. Now I understand why they call this passageway the Dragon's Teeth, thought Brenton. A few moments later, two bodies emerged from the left side channel and floated towards them, along with a sizable amount of wood, debris and wreckage. Brenton took off his hat and pressed it against his chest in a show of respect for the fallen. "God have mercy on their souls," said the first mate. "Aye," replied Brenton. The ship then lurched again as the current suddenly gained speed. "Captain, look," cried the first mate. Ahead of them, rising out of the water, was a series of sharp, jutting rocks that forced the channel to move faster and more erratically, as it flowed around them like a gigantic, slithering snake. Brenton then looked up at his sails and noticed that they were now slack against the breeze. This meant that they weren't going to help him power his way around the stones. Instead, he would be forced to use the current to his advantage, and trust greatly in the skill of his helmsman to make it through this next challenge. He then looked over the side of the ship and studied the flow of the water. It was moving in a deceptively confusing pattern. Moments later, the lead ship ahead of him entered the snaking channel of water, bumping into several things as it did before suddenly getting snagged on a hidden sandbar. This allowed the raging water to quickly tear the ship apart and drag its shattered remains under the water. The next ship, however, was able to successfully avoid the mistakes of the first and, in turn, safely navigate the channel. The Artigo soon did the same, taking the example of the second ship to steer safely through the challenging obstacles before them. As they came out the other side, Brenton sighed in relief. So far, so good, he thought. He wondered how many more challenges he would have to face, and if his ship and crew would even make it out of this alive. He then smiled slightly. If they did, there would be a lot less competitors for him to deal with when they returned home, as many of the most foolish and greedy among them would soon be eliminated by the Cape and its multitude of traps and snares. Suddenly he heard a sloshing growl echo from the waters. Just ahead of him was a series of stony spikes that protruded up from the water below, and down from the ceiling above at the same time, blocking their path. This struck fear into every man on the ship, as it was very obvious that these rocks were completely impassable. But then something happened that amazed everyone. They all watched in wonder as the water began to rise up, lifting the ship before them high enough that they were able to easily pass safely over the spikes in the water. It then dove down again soon after, allowing the ship to easily slip under the spikes in the ceiling. Just then, Brenton realized what was happening. "Steady as she goes," he said. "But, Captain, don't you see the danger?" protested the helmsman. "I do. And that is why we will be able to avoid them, whereas others will not." "Aye, sir," said the helmsman. Brenton watched anxiously as his ship quickly approached the spikes ahead as the water in the channel continued to retreat. Eventually, though, it began rising again, and within moments the spikes had vanished completely beneath the waves, allowing the Artigo to safely pass over them. Brenton then watched anxiously as they approached the next obstacle, a series of sharp spikes hanging from the ceiling. Moments later, just like with the previous ship, as they drew close to the spikes, the water subsided, clearing the way for his ship to safely pass under them. However, the water wasn't receding fast enough for the ship in front of them to safely clear the spikes. And, sure enough, just as it passed under the great spikes in the ceiling, one of its masts grazed several of them, dislodging them from the ceiling, and sending them crashing into the deck below. These, in turn, crashed through the ship, and out the bottom, punching great holes in it. This caused the ship ahead of them to quickly take on water. The ship then began to slowly ride lower and lower in the water as she gradually began to sink. To make matters worse, this now made her sit too low in the water to escape the next set of teeth that lay ahead. And, with the gut-wrenching sound of shattering boards and rending planks, the ship was driven into those vicious stone teeth, and destroyed. She vanished beneath the waves moments later. Realizing that there was very little room for error, Brenton carefully studied the water ahead as he searched for a solution to the puzzle of the teeth. He soon realized what he needed to do. Steer out of the main channel. "We need to slow our ship," he said. "Aye, Captain," replied the helmsman. The Art-Ego then pulled to the side of the channel, and into the slower currents near the edge of it, which quickly brought the Art-Ego's wild, forward pace to a slow crawl. Another ship, that was behind them in the channel, soon caught up to them, and drove past them into the teeth, where it too was destroyed. A few moments later, Brenton ordered his ship back into the channel again. Having timed his return perfectly, the Art-Ego safely flowed over the first row of teeth, under the spikes in the ceiling, past the second row of teeth, a second group of spikes in the ceiling, and then over a final set of teeth at the end of the passageway. The channel then narrowed and sped up briefly before opening out into a large, shallow bay. Moments later the wind returned and quickly filled his sails. Trying to determine what he should do next, he raised his telescope and scouted the entire shoreline of the bay. As he did, he spotted a large house made of stone sitting on the shore. In front of it was the symbol of the Pirate King perched awkwardly in the sand. Brenton smiled. They'd finally found the treasure they'd come for. Now all they had to do was claim it. Strike the sails and lower the anchor. "We're going ashore," he said. "Aye, Captain," replied the first mate. A few minutes later, Brenton, his first mate, and 5 other sailors all climbed into one of the longboats and quickly rowed their way to shore. Upon reaching land, they climbed out and approached the stone house cautiously. Inside they found nothing but a simple wooden table, in the middle of which sat a small stone tablet. Brenton picked it up, brushed off the dust, and read it. "Silver and gold have I none to give ye, nor treasure that might make ye rich, save only for this one thing. If ye hast made it thus far, then thou hast gained the only treasure that I can give ye, thy life. For there is none other treasure under the heavens, and in the sea, that is greater than this." Brenton put the tablet down on the table and turned to his men, who looked at him excitedly. However, his expression soon drained all hope and excitement from them. "Where's the treasure, Captain?" asked the first mate. "It appears that we've been tricked, and there is no treasure. Just a note from the Pirate King congratulating us on successfully surviving the Cape," said Brenton. "No treasure," said the first mate in surprise. Brenton nodded. "It would seem not. However, while we have not found the very thing that we sought for, we can still come away from this adventure with the knowledge that we have survived the greatest challenge that any man can ever know, and do so with our lives still intact. That, in itself, is a reward beyond words. And, while I know it will not fill our bellies, we can at least feel blessed that we still have something that can be filled." The first mate nodded sadly. "Aye, Captain. If you say so." The men then turned and plodded back to the longboat feeling discouraged and defeated as they did. They'd all come along on this journey with a deep-seated hope of gaining a portion of the Pirate King's vast treasure. Instead they were leaving empty-handed. Even so, Brenton knew that merely surviving all they'd just gone through was treasure enough. He then turned and strolled out to the longboat. However, as he did, the words of the tablet rattled in his mind. He knew the king of the pirates to be a brilliant man. But to die with no treasure, after enjoying unspeakable riches his entire life, seemed out of place to him. So Brenton turned and walked back towards the house as the first mate looked on curiously. "What's the matter, Captain?" he asked. "There's something I want to check on. I fear that we may have missed something." The first mate found this curious and followed his captain back to the stone house. He knew Brenton to be a brilliant man. So if he was having second thoughts about what they'd found, then the first mate was willing to help him investigate it. Brenton soon walked back into the little stone house and looked around it carefully, doing his very best to observe every part of it with great detail. He soon picked up the stone tablet again and studied it carefully. To his surprise, as he examined it more closely, he realized that it wasn't just a simple message, but rather a clue, and a very well-disguised one at that. A smile soon drew across his face. Well, crafty as always, aren't we, Captain?" he said to himself. "What is it, sir?" asked his first mate. Brenton turned and showed the tablet to him. "What we thought was a simple message of defeat is actually a clue, my friend. Just like those that led us here, this is yet another piece in the puzzle of the great Pirate King's secret treasure, and its whereabouts. The first mate looked at him in confusion. "What are you saying?" he asked. Brenton pointed to the tablet, and then the table. "The clue we are searching for is not in this tablet, but rather the very place in which we stand." The first mate scratched his head in confusion. "I do not understand, Captain," he replied. Brenton gestured to the house around him. "The answer is right before us. We stand within a lonely stone house, inside of which is a rock of wisdom that rests upon a table of fellowship. That is the clue that the great pirate king has left us. But only those who have wisdom can see it," he replied. The first mate studied his captain's face for several moments before suddenly realizing the meaning of the clue. "Boulder House," he exclaimed. "Exactly. Our next clue awaits us at the lighthouse, on the table of the four absent kings, outside of the village of Boulder House," exclaimed Brenton. "Brilliant, Captain. Once again the Pirate King shows us just how incredibly wise he was, and you even more so." Brenton nodded as he placed the tablet down on the table again. "Indeed it does. Thus, that is to be our next destination. Now, ready the crew, as we must first make our way out of here, and into the open sea, after which we will make haste to reach the lighthouse before anyone else does." The first mate saluted, and said, "Aye, aye, Captain." "Captain! Sails!" came the cry from across the deck. Jack Spareleg, captain of the pirate galleon Molly's Revenge, looked up from his place on the fantail of his ship and saw the young boy, his lookout in the crow's nest, pointing off to the east. Curious, he looked that way, but saw nothing. So he raised his telescope and scanned the shoreline. Suddenly, as though sailing through the very island itself, the Art Ego appeared, her sails full of wind as she sliced effortlessly through the water. Jack lowered his telescope and looked off towards the Art Ego in interest. His first mate soon stepped up to his side, took his own telescope, and looked off in the same direction. After a few moments he lowered the telescope before looking back at his captain. "Should I weigh anchor, sir, and set full sail? We don't want them to escape us laden with all of the Pirate King's gold," he said. However, to his surprise, Jack waved for him to stop. "Our efforts to take their ship will be of no benefit to us," said Jack. The first mate looked at him in confusion. "How so, sir? She is the only ship thus far to survive the Cape, the hiding place of the Pirate King's vast treasure," he replied. But Jack shook his head. "They sail too lightly to have taken even a single shilling of gold. No, it is clear to me that they have only acquired a bit of knowledge, and not the actual treasure," he said. "Knowledge, sir?" asked the first mate. Jack frowned slightly. The Pirate King was far too wise of a man to simply hide his treasure in a place where anyone could find it, and make off with its vast bounty. "If I were him, I would have hid it in a way that no mere scallywag could steal the mountains of gold that I had collected. No, I would have merely left a clue, but no gold of any kind," he replied. The first mate pondered this. "Is such the reason why you have chosen not to partake of the Pirate King's first challenge, but rather to wait here instead in hopes of finding another, much safer means by which to gain this first clue to the whereabouts of the Pirate King's treasure?" he asked. "Indeed I have, for which I am most grateful," said Jack. The first mate thought about this briefly, and then cocked his head slightly. "So how shall we acquire this first clue, now that we know where to find it?" he asked. Jack grinned slyly. "That will be quite easy, actually. Now that we know that there is a hidden entrance on the backside of the Cape, we only need to enter through there, and we can take, for free, what others have given their lives to capture. Now, raise sail, and set course for the east of the Cape. However, keep your distance, and only explore it from afar, as I do not believe that the Pirate King would have left the exit to this challenge unguarded, as even a fool is lucky enough at times to overcome even the best of hidden doors." "Aye, Captain," replied the first mate. The Molly's Revenge then raised sail, struck anchor, and made for the exit of the Cape. As they closed on it, still well beyond its beautiful, crystal blue waters, Jack took notice of a place along the shore that was filled with trees. But he wasn't interested in it because of the greenery that dotted its picturesque and sandy shoals. What caught his interest was the strange carpet of casks, planks, and other debris that seemed to appear from nowhere and float out into the sea. Whatever was there, it was hidden from view, and thus too risky to approach by ship. So he turned to his first mate, and said, "Prepare the long boats. We will send men ashore to find what it is that we search for. But be sure that, no matter what they find, they take nothing, nor harm anything, as we may, as yet, need to return here at some point to scour this land again, and thus we should not risk erasing any clues that we find." "Aye, Captain," replied the first mate. The crew soon lowered a longboat into the sea, with 6 crewmen aboard, who then quickly made their way towards the shore. However, as they approached it, Jack and his crew watched in shock and horror as the sea seemed to rise up and consume their boat, dragging it, and all 6 men, below the waves. So they sent out a second boat, which suffered the same fate. Jack was both appalled and intrigued by this. It would seem that the Pirate King was wiser than any of us realized. Even the land itself, and the sea, are built to keep out those who refuse to partake in his trials, he said quietly to himself. He then turned to his first mate, and said, "Call the other ships together. We need to discuss what our plans will be to overcome this challenge." "Aye, Captain," replied the first mate. He then turned to the ship's signal man, and ordered him to relay the message. Within 20 minutes, all 9 of Jack's ships had gathered together, and weighed anchor in a tight, easily traveled raft of ships. And, while the ships clearly did not like being tied together as they were, given how the waves of the sea tossed them about, it worked for what they needed. Eventually the 9 captains decided to send men to a seemingly clear and unencumbered stretch of beach some distance from the exit of the cape. To everyone's great relief, they were able to land safely. However, as they walked down the beach, and drew close to the exit, they came across traps that they didn't expect, which killed several of them, and hindered their progress. Jack marveled at this. Clearly the Pirate King had thought of everything. This is exactly why he was king, and not someone else. The men on the beach, despite the hindrances, and the danger, continued trying to get close to the exit from the cape, but repeatedly failed to do so. It was during this time that they discovered that one of the young lads with them, a cabin boy by rank, could see the traps that were blocking them, whereas the other men could not. So, using his small size, and his ability to detect the traps, they were able to penetrate the defenses around the exit from the cape, and enter the small bay that held the little stone house that Brenton, and the crew of the Artigo, had already found. Having been instructed by their captains to not harm or touch anything inside, as only clues would be found there, and not gold, the men diligently, but cautiously searched the entire shoreline of the bay, and recorded in detail everything they found. This included drawings, and detailed notes that were created by the young cabin boy. Then, having finished their investigation, they all returned to their long boats, using the young cabin boy's skills to guide them, and made for their ships. Once there they took what they discovered and gave it to Jack. But, what was presented to him did not leave the salty old pirate captain feeling as though he had gained anything beneficial from the effort. If anything, he felt just as defeated as Brenton had been when he'd first seen the little stone house. Eventually he dismissed his men, and then returned to his cabin to contemplate this. There had to be a clue here, as the Pirate King would not build such a complex series of traps and trials just to protect nothing. Jack soon sat down at his map table, in his cabin at the back of the ship, poured himself a glass of rum, and then began to read everything that his men had brought back with them. He knew that the Pirate King was no fool. So, whatever he had done to this place, especially given all the traps that were laid for anyone daring to breach its sacred beaches, it meant that something important was hidden inside. He just had to figure out what. He quietly studied the papers on his map table for hours, mulling over each one of them in his mind as he tried to understand what the clue was that the Pirate King had left behind. Suddenly, as though a light had gone on in his head, he came to a realization of what he was seeing. The answers he was seeking had been there the entire time. It just took a very wise mind to see past the thick veil of deception that had been placed over them. He then tossed down the papers, raced out of his cabin, and looked up at the helmsman. "Helm, set course for Boulder House, best possible speed," he shouted. The other men looked at him in confusion, uncertain what to make of this strange and confusing outburst by their captain. "Sir?" asked the first mate in confusion. "Boulder House." That's what the stone house in the bay at the end of the challenge was pointing to. "Somewhere in that village is the next clue in our search for the Pirate King's treasure," shouted Jack excitedly. The others pondered this deeply for several moments, and then began to understand what their captain was suggesting. Their eyes soon lit up with excitement. "Aye, sir. We'll get right on it," shouted the first mate. The Art-Ego slowly drifted into dock, along the shoreline of the village of Boulder House, and then tied off. But, as they did, the villagers looked at Brenton and his privateer crew, and became nervous at their mere presence. "Do you come to rob us, dear sir, or are you here for other reasons?" asked the dockmaster. Brenton stepped down the ramp from his ship, and onto the dock, as he gestured reassuringly to the villagers gathered there. "We do not come to take what is your own. We're merely here in search of supplies, and a clue that is part of a quest we are on. To prove so, we will pay for all the provisions that we take from you today, as we will not act this day to your harm, but rather your benefit," said Brenton. This surprised the villagers. Usually when pirates and privateers came there, they looted the village, and took from them everything that could be carried away. As such, Brenton and the Art-Ego were a breath of fresh air. "Very well, sir, we will speak with your boatswain as soon as he is able, and provide you with everything you need, and at a fair price, even," said the dockmaster. Brenton bowed slightly. "Thank you. We greatly appreciate your willingness to aid us," he said. "And we also appreciate that you are not looting us, what with you being a privateer and all," winked the dockmaster. Brenton chuckled. "Such is indeed fair," he replied. He then turned to his first mate, and said, "Come, let's begin our search for the clue that we came here to find." "Aye, Captain," said the first mate. Brenton and his men then made their way off the dock and into the adjoining village. As they walked, they could see the look of concern on the faces of the citizens around them. Privateer or not, they looked every bit like pirates to the people who were there. And, even though they weren't raping, pillaging, and plundering like pirates typically would, the people were still cautious of him and his crew. Brenton and his men soon made their way out of the little village and over to a lighthouse that sat perched on a hill that overlooked the sea. However, as they approached it, they were surprised to find it locked, and a sign posted on the door that read, "This lighthouse is now fully automated, and no longer manned." Brenton and the others found this curious. "What do we do, Captain?" asked the first mate. Just then a man came around the side of the lighthouse and was surprised to see the small band of sailors standing in front of him. "Do ye be pirates?" he asked. Brenton shook his head. "We're not, good sir. We're explorers who have come to study your lighthouse," he replied. That was a clear and obvious lie. However, for him right now, finding the clue they'd come for was more important than who they really were. The groundskeeper studied them for several moments, before shaking his head. "Strange explorers ye be, indeed. Why, ye look like pirates to me. But, who am I to judge? Is there something that I can help ye with?" he asked. "We were hoping to find the lightkeeper," said Brenton. "Aye, that be me. Although, I am more a gardener now than a keeper," replied the man. Brenton glanced briefly at the door, and then back at the man. "The sign on the door says that your lighthouse is no longer manned. How can that be?" "We have never heard of such a thing," he said. The keeper grinned. "Aye, she now be entirely a piece of clockwork. Just raise the weights but once a week, and top off the oil, and she be doing all the rest." "She is indeed a marvel of technology," he replied. Brenton and his men found this intriguing. "So then there's nothing you need to do anymore with this lighthouse?" he asked. "Nay, only what I have stated, and nothing more," replied the keeper. "Fascinating." "Indeed," grinned the keeper. "Is there anything else I can do for thee?" Brenton turned and gazed at his men, at which point they began a deep conversation, not with words, but merely with their eyes. They soon came to the agreement to not tell the keeper the true purpose of them being there. Brenton soon turned back to the keeper. At this time, there is not. We merely wish to look around your grounds, and satisfy our desire to see its beauty and majesty, he said. Aye, that ye may do. Just don't touch anything, as I would not wish for ye to break anything that I must then repair, said the keeper. Brenton tipped his hat to the keeper, and then motioned for his men to spread out and begin their search of the area. After nearly 20 minutes of seemingly fruitless searching, one of the men spotted something and then called out to the others. "Oi, Captain! I found something," he shouted. Brenton and the others all rushed over to his side, and were surprised to find a large, almost pink slab of rock laying partially buried in the dirt. It didn't take Brenton long to realize what they had just found. "This is the Blizzard Stone," he said. "The what, sir?" asked one of the men. "The Blizzard Stone. There's a legend that says, if one can find the Blizzard Stone, it will lead them to great treasure, the likes of which none have ever seen." The first mate soon knelt down in front of the stone, and brushed aside some of the dirt and plants that were partially covering it. "Captain, there's some writing on it, inscribed directly into the stone," he said. "What does it say?" asked Brenton. The first mate scratched his head. "I'm not quite sure what to make of it, Captain. It reads, east is west, and south is north. To lands far gone shall you go forth, where dragons lived, and fire burned. The waves are torn and the winds are turned." "What do you think it means?" he said. Brenton gently massaged his chin as he pondered the words on the stone. "It sounds like a puzzle, if you ask me," said one of the men. "Indeed it does," replied Brenton. They all then stood and quietly pondered the words that were written on the stone. Brenton, upon taking a closer look at the stone, soon realized that the top of it was angled, almost as though it was the needle on a compass. Even more intriguing was that it pointed due east. Just then his mind began to unravel the mystery of the rock, causing his eyes to grow wide. The others soon noticed this and perked up excitedly. "Have you solved it, Captain?" asked one of them. Brenton again massaged his chin thoughtfully. "East is west, and south is north. That seems to indicate that we're to go in the opposite direction of where we are pointed. And, if you look at the stone, it's pointing east. Turn that around, and we are to go west. However, it also says that south is north. So, if something is directing us to go south, then we need to go north," he said. "Or, perhaps northwest," said one of the men. Brenton looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" he asked. "The text says that we are to go to lands far gone, where dragons lived, and fire burned. That sounds like a volcanic island, and there is one, albeit a dead one, thankfully, that is to the northeast of here," replied the man. "Aye, but it says that the waves are torn, and the winds are turned," said the first mate. "Indeed it does. But volcanic islands tend to have rough shores where waves are often broken up and cast about as they crash upon the beach. There's also the fact that the mountain itself diverts air merely by its massive size. So, in a sense, it turns the wind," replied Brenton. "That does seem to fit with that island, sir," said the man. "Indeed it does." "All right, everyone, back to the ship," said Brenton. "Aye, Captain," came the combined replies. The men all then made their way back to the dock, where they found that the crew had just finished loading the last of the supplies they'd purchased, and were ready to set sail. They then quickly made their way back out into the ocean, sailed around the island, and then out into the wider ocean on course for their next destination. Several hours later their rival, Jack Spareleg, of the Molly's Revenge, and his fleet, arrived just off the shoreline of the village of Boulder House, on the heels of the Artago's departure. Upon seeing this, the residents all began to quake in fear, knowing that, without question, they were about to be plundered by pirates. However, as they watched, their fear soon turned into confusion as the Molly's Revenge pulled into their docks alone, and without any assistance from any of the other ships of Jack's fleet. It then disgorged its captain, the first mate, and the boatswain's mate. The three men soon made their way up to the lighthouse, looked around for a time, and then reboarded their ship without causing even a single bit of mischief. Soon after this they pushed away from the dock, turned, and sailed to the east, having done nothing to the village, nor harmed it in any way. The villagers all looked at each other in confusion, uncertain of what to make of this. "Have pirates become polite and behaved of late?" asked one of them. "Nay, I think they're acting as they are because they have a treasure that they seek which is far greater than anything that we can offer them. Thus, we are ignored for now until that treasure is found, and their coffers filled," said the dockmaster. One of the villagers grunted in disbelief. "Huh, polite pirates. Will miracles never cease?" he replied. Brenton looked through his telescope from the bow of his ship and studied the large volcanic island that slowly grew larger before them. He soon lowered the telescope and pondered what his next move would be. "Do you believe this is the place?" asked his first mate. Brenton nodded. "If this is where all the clues point to, then this is indeed where we need to go," he replied. "But what if it's just another stop, or another clue in our hunt for his treasure?" Brenton smiled, and patted the man on the shoulder. "Then we will keep hunting until we find the treasure, as I desire to ensure the security and well-being of all my men, and their families, for decades to come. That is why I have made such effort, and taken such risk, in this journey. If it was just about the gold, I would not have begun this quest, as the risks to us outweigh any gains we would have achieved." "But will chests of gold for each of us ensure our best future?" asked the first mate. Brenton chuckled. "Gold itself will not. But it will certainly aid you in ensuring that your tables are never bare, nor your families in want, ever again." "Aye, Captain," smiled the first mate. The Artigo soon reached the island, and then sailed around the far side where they would be hidden from the eyes of anyone who might have followed them, as he had no delusions that others would somehow make it through the cape and also decode the clues that lay there, as well as those found on the Blizzard Stone. So, the less the chance that they might be found, and in a vulnerable position at that, the better. Once they had secured themselves in a safe harbor on the other side, they climbed into the longboats, and made their way toward shore. As they stepped onto the black, sandy beaches of the volcanic island, everyone did so with great caution, knowing that this place was almost certainly a former stronghold of the Pirate King, and thus one that would be guarded by many crafty and well-thought-out traps. However, to their complete surprise, they encountered none of these as they explored the island. In fact, it was so quiet and tranquil that Brenton, and his men, were beginning to question if they had even come to the right place. After all, why would the Pirate King leave his greatest treasure unprotected after putting so many crews through hell just to find it? "It be mighty quiet here, Captain. Not trap, nor snare, nor even ghost," said one of the men. "I would have to agree with you on that." "This seems very atypical of the great Pirate King," replied Brenton with concern. "Perhaps that's by design," said the first mate. "Explain," replied Brenton. "If it is the nature of the Pirate King to lay snares and traps, would it not seem out of character for him were he not to?" Brenton pondered this for a bit, and then nodded. "Indeed it would. And, if one came this far, and found nothing that hindered his way, then one might think that they have landed upon the wrong island," he replied thoughtfully. "But why would the Pirate King do something so foolish?" asked one of the men. "If you feed a dog long enough on rotten meat, he will not trust you when you give him the good meat instead," said the first mate. "Agreed," replied Brenton. "Even so, we should proceed deeper. If it turns out we are wrong, then we will move to a different island. However, I suspect that we will discover that we are correct in choosing this island as the location of the Pirate King's treasure." "Aye, Captain, I pray you are right." "So do I." Brenton and his men continued to move deeper into the island until they stumbled onto a trail that led around the base of the great volcano, which sat at the center of the island, and over to the other side. They also soon found a series of trail markers that warned all those who approached to turn back, lest they die as punishment for disturbing the Pirate King's treasure. Brenton grinned. "It would seem that we have indeed found the right island, and his treasure," he said. "Nay, not his treasure, as yet, but merely the signposts to its location," said one of the men. "Yes, but signposts are good enough proof that we are in the right place," said another. "Indeed they are," replied Brenton. The men then continued to follow the trail as it meandered up the side of the volcano. However, as they did, they came across a sight that began to drive fear into the men. Dead bodies. Quite a few of them in fact, and in various states of decay. "It would seem that others have come before us, and failed to come away with the treasure," said Brenton. "Or perhaps they fought and died over it, leaving us with nothing that we can take away from our journey here," said one of his men. "Don't give up just yet, lads. Until we can verify with our own eyes that the treasure has already been taken, there is still hope for us that we may, as yet, come away from this as very rich men," said the first mate reassuringly. "Agreed. Even so, we should proceed forward with great caution, as it would appear that the Pirate King has not left this island entirely without deadly snares or traps as we first thought that he had," said Brenton. "Shall we prepare to fight, sir?" asked one of the men. Brenton thought about this briefly, and then nodded. "That may be advisable," he replied. The men all then drew their swords and pistols before proceeding forward with ever greater amounts of caution as they turned their eyes in every direction in search of anything that might threaten either them or impede their path. Eventually they came across a cavern, carved with great care using chisel and hammer into the hard, obsidian rock of the mountain. However, what they saw there as they drew closer to it struck fear into all of them. In front of the door they found dozens and dozens of dead bodies stacked like cordwood on both sides of the trail in great heaps. It was as though many had arrived here before them, but then fell in great numbers, slain by as yet unknown means, and then cast aside like driftwood to make way for the plunder of the cavern. Upon seeing this, one of the men stepped forward to examine the bodies, but was stopped by a shout from Brenton. The man turned back curiously to look at his captain. "Do not touch the bodies, as it is possible that they have fallen to a deadly disease, or even possibly a poison left behind by the Pirate King to protect his gold, as it would not be beneath him to do so," said Brenton. Realizing the danger he was in, the man backed up several paces and made sure not to come anywhere near the bodies. However, after several moments of observation and contemplation, the first mate took note of something. "Be it far from me to question your judgment, Captain, but these bodies may not be as dangerous to us as one might think," he said. "Explain," said Brenton curiously. "I see no corpses here from any of the animals that live on this island. That does not seem right, as they would not waste the chance to dine on the flesh of these men who have fallen here, were they to have the chance," he replied. Brenton contemplated this briefly, and then shook his head. "Such is true. However, they may still have dined on these men's bones at one time, and then died shortly after in another place on this island. So spread out your men, and search the area as their corpses may lie elsewhere," he said. "Aye, Captain," replied the first mate. The men then did as Brenton asked, moving cautiously through the trees and other growth around them. However, search as they might, they found no animal bones, nor corpses. They eventually returned and reported this to him. Brenton found this curious. So whatever has killed these men, it is not something that would also kill an animal that had stumbled onto their decaying corpses, he said, more to himself than anyone else. Feeling emboldened by this, Brenton stepped forward, much to the displeasure of his men, who begged him not to go, and approached the cavern door. As he shielded his eyes to get a look inside, he noticed dozens more corpses laying scattered on the ground all around the cavern. What intrigued him the most, though, was that, at the center of the cavern, near the very back, rested the bones of a man in pirate's garb sitting regally on a lavish throne of gold and jewels. It didn't take Brenton long to realize who he was looking at. It was the Pirate King himself. Brenton then noticed that, piled up along both sides of the cavern, were vast quantities of gold, silver, and treasure the likes of which none of them had ever seen. Just then one of his men noticed something peculiar about the bodies. "Oi, Captain, come look at this," he shouted. Brenton quickly hurried over to his crewman, and saw that he was pointing at something on a corpse in front of him. "Do not touch him," protested Brenton. "Aye, Captain, I am not, for I am no fool. However, take a look at this. Some of these men are from ships we know," said the man. Brenton approached where his crewman was standing, and then dropped to one knee as he cautiously studied the dead man in front of him at well beyond arm's reach. He soon noticed that the crewman was correct. He then scanned the area around him and quickly realized that the other bodies were from not only the same crew, but others as well. It would seem that some other ships have already reached the treasure before us, but were accursed with death for their foolish attempt to plunder the Pirate King's treasure, he said. The first mate shook his head. Even in death, the Pirate King guards his own, he replied. It would seem so. But how? Asked Brenton. I do not know, sir, as I see no sign of sword, nor musket ball that has brought these men to their graves, said the first mate. Which means their deaths were had by things which cannot be seen, replied Brenton. Poison, said one of the men. Brenton nodded. That is likely what they have fallen to. Then how do we collect a treasure that is too deadly to handle, as we do not know the nature of this poison, nor how to defeat it? Asked the first mate. Brenton stood up and studied the cavern again. However, before he could answer, a shout rose up from among his men. Brenton turned around to see what the commotion was about, and soon noticed that one of his men was pointing off into the distance. Captain! Sails, he shouted. Surprised to hear this, Brenton took out his telescope and aimed it in the direction that the man was pointing. It didn't take him long to spot a fleet of pirate ships approaching the island in the distance. It was Jack Spareleg and his fleet. Despite having initially turned the wrong way, he'd quickly realized the folly of his decision, and immediately corrected his course. For Brenton, this had been a blessing in disguise, as it had given them extra time to reach and then explore the island. However, that time had now run out and, because of this, their mortal enemy would soon be upon them. Unfortunately, Brenton didn't have either the men, nor the ships, to defend himself against such a powerful rival. He soon lowered his telescope and frowned. It would seem that Jack has unraveled the Pirate King's puzzles as well, and bears down on us even as we speak, he said. What do we do, Captain? Asked the first mate. As we do not have enough time to unravel the mysteries of the poison, and the other traps that protect this cavern, we will retreat down the mountain for now, to a place of safety, and watch from a distance as Jack and his crew explore this cavern in our stead. Perhaps, in their doing so, we may discover a way to safely plunder the Pirate King's treasure, said Brenton. Aye, Captain, said the first mate. Brenton and his men then hurried away from the cavern, down the mountain, and over to a place that was some distance away, yet within easy sight of the cavern. About an hour later Jack, and many from among his crews, landed on the beaches of the island, and quickly made their way to the cavern, where they too paused upon seeing all of the corpses stacked up there. And, while his men were more than ready to capture all of the gold, and take it away to their ships, their captain was wise enough to know that one should never underestimate the Pirate King. Especially when so many bodies lay stacked up around the door, and along the trail that led to this place. Brenton was glad for this. Despite him and Jack being mortal rivals, Brenton didn't want to see him act foolishly and bring not only himself, but also all of his men unnecessarily to their graves. However, that would not be the case this time. Despite all of Jack's wisdom, his greed was more powerful and too great for him to overcome. He soon ordered his men to enter the cave and begin plundering it of all that it contained. His men gleefully obeyed him with reckless abandon. But, it wasn't long after this before they began to mysteriously grow sick, and begin dying. This sent waves of terror through Jack's men. Uncertain what to do, Jack's men began to drop their gold and run for the ships, only to die on their way down the hillside. This explained to Brenton and his men why there were so many bodies that lined the trail which led up to the cavern. Wanting to encourage his men, and show them that they had nothing to fear, Jack entered the cavern, picked up a small chest, and then began to leave. However, within just a few moments after passing through the doorway, he too collapsed to the ground, and died. Brenton swore. Stupid, greedy fool, he muttered. Wanting not to be cursed, one of the men picked up the small chest that was in his now fallen leader's hands, and returned it to the cavern. However, he too fell soon after, as had so many others before him inside the cavern of treasure. If I were a betting man, sir, I do not believe there is any way that we can safely acquire the gold that is within that cavern, said the first mate. While Brenton didn't want to agree with him, he was slowly beginning to lean in that direction. Even so, he held out hope that they might still come away with some gold from this adventure, as he knew that there was no way that this one single cavern contained the entirety of the Pirate King's vast wealth. If anything, it seemed more like a lure and a trap to destroy the greedy and send them swiftly to their graves. Eventually, all those who remained of Jack's expedition fled back to their ships, raised sail, and quickly made for safer lands. Seeing that it was now safe to return, Brenton and his men carefully made their way back to the cavern, but stayed a safe distance outside of it. The smell of filthy, unwashed bodies poked at their noses as they tried their best to stand strong against the fear that now gripped them. As they did, Brenton looked down at Jack's now dead body that lay on the ground at his feet, and pondered what he would do next. He had to get at least a small portion of the Pirate King's treasure to ensure the well-being of his men so that they would never go hungry, and would have ample wealth for themselves and their families, so that they could comfortably live on it, grow old, and be happy the rest of their lives. Just then an idea came to him. "Stay here and wait for me. Do not attempt to follow me. If I fall, take the men back to the ship and flee this place," he said. "Captain," asked the first mate in confusion. "What is it that you are planning to do?" Brenton looked briefly at the cavern, and then back at the first mate, who immediately knew what Brenton planned to do. "Oh, Captain, no. Do not do what I believe you are intending to do," he protested. "I will not risk the lives of my men on something that needs to be done to solve this mystery," he said. "But, Captain," said the first mate in concern. However, Brenton would not be swayed. "I have made up my mind. Now stay here. I shall return to you shortly. But, if not, then flee this island, and take our men to safety," he said. The first mate sighed in displeasure. There would be no changing Brenton's mind. "Aye, Captain. As you wish," he replied sadly. Brenton soon turned his full attention to the cavern, steeled his courage, and cautiously entered. He then paused and waited for several moments to see if the curse of the cavern might strike him down too. However, when nothing happened, he found himself both blessed and somewhat confused. So he quietly stood where he was and scanned the cavern. It was at this moment that he realized that everyone who had touched the vast treasure that was stacked up along the walls had died. Those that had not had lived. Apparently the gold was poisoned. The only thing he didn't know was how many other things were as well. Understanding this, he would need to avoid touching anything in the cavern to keep from being poisoned himself. He then turned himself slowly in a circle as he took in everything around him in search for clues to this mystery, and that of the Pirate King's treasure. Just then he noticed something on a small table in front of the Pirate King's corpse and throne. It was a small stone tablet like the one at Point Cape. Not wanting to touch it for fear that it too was poisoned, Brenton leaned over it and carefully studied the inscription that was carved into it. "The silver and gold which lies within this cavern is mine, and mine alone. All who enter here and seek to take such treasures shall be cursed with death," it read. Brenton furrowed his brow. If nothing else, the text was accurate, as the hillside leading up to the cavern were littered with the corpses of men who bear testament to this. He then pondered this briefly as he continued to study the cavern, only to realize that, on the back wall, behind the Pirate King's throne, hung a painting. It was tattered and weather-worn, but still in good enough shape to be read and understood. On it was a drawing of the island, and a marker that denoted the very cavern in which he stood. But it wasn't those markings that interested him the most. It was a sailor, standing to the side of the volcano, who was pointing towards a seemingly hidden place on the far side of the mountain near the same pathway they had used when they'd first landed. Brenton cocked an eyebrow at this and wondered if the cavern he now stood in was actually meant to trap the foolish, and send them to their graves in punishment for their greed. There was only one way to find out. He hurried out of the cavern, and immediately ordered his men to follow him around the mountain, and back towards their ship. The men begrudgingly obeyed, saddened that they would now come away from this adventure not only devoid of a single shilling of the Pirate King's gold, but also much poorer than when they had begun their journey. However, when Brenton, upon reaching the other side of the mountain, suddenly turned down a small, almost hidden trail to his right, it surprised his men. Even so, they followed him. If the cavern had caused him to go insane, they would still follow him all the way to the end, if for no other reason than in honor of all he had done for them over the many years in which they had served him. Eventually the small trail opened out into a clearing near the black, obsidian walls of the mountain. Brenton then walked up to the wall and studied it with interest for several moments as though studying a painting. Just then he realized what he was looking at, and it amazed him. Reaching out, his hand met a stiff, dust-covered canvas tarp that was integrated into the hillside so perfectly that one would not have even known it was even there had they not touched it. Quickly spreading out his hands in both directions, he searched for the side of it. It wasn't long before he found one of its edges, and gave it a firm, solid tug as he cast it aside like a sheet of liquid midnight. As he did, he was hit in the face by a brilliant light that nearly blinded him. But, as his eyes slowly adjusted to the glare, he began to realize what he was looking at. It was apparent that his men did as well, as they all gasped in surprise at what they saw. Dug into the side of the mountain, in the same way as the Pirate King's cavern, was a small cave filled to the walls and ceiling with gold, silver, precious jewels, and treasures the likes of which none of them had ever seen before. The men were astounded at the beauty of it all. Deciding to ensure that this gold was not poison in the same way as it was in the other cavern, Brenton took a handful of it into his hands, sniffed at it, and then let it rest in his fingers for several moments. But when he did not either become ill or fall dead, he knew that this gold was safe, and no poison had been placed on it, as was the case with the treasures in the other cavern. "Is it safe to approach, Captain?" asked the first mate. Brenton smiled, and poured out the gold in his hands back onto the pile before him. "It is indeed. It would seem that the great Pirate King, while keeping a small portion of his treasure for himself, has left us nearly the entirety of his vast and boundless wealth to enjoy as we see fit," he replied. "Then, it is safe for us to take it?" asked the first mate. "It is indeed, my friend. However, let us not be greedy and remove all that is stored here. Instead, we should only take what we will need to ensure a good life for each of us. The rest we will leave for others to find in the same way as we have." I believe that was the Pirate King's wishes, and the sole reason why he did so much to ensure that only the best found his treasure. I also believe that, despite his vast riches, he was a man who despised greed. Hence the many traps he set for those who would seek his gold, not simply to find those who would be the best at their trade, but also those who would care more for others than for themselves because, had we been greedy, I do not believe we would have survived as far as we have. So take only what we need, and then cover the treasure again so that others may experience the joy that we had in finding the great Pirate King's treasure. The men, upon hearing this, were both filled with joy, as well as great respect for the now departed Pirate King. Obeying Brenton's orders, they gathered up only what gold, and silver, and treasures that they could both carry, and would need to ensure a good life for themselves, and their families, and then loaded them onto the ship. Afterwards they resealed the cavern to hide the treasure, boarded their ship, and made for home, both rich beyond their wildest dreams, and yet also content with what they had. But what of the remainder of the Pirate King's treasure? What became of it? Well, that's something you'll have to find out for yourself. The end.